Welcome back to Playful Whimsies. Today I'm reading The Bad Table Manners Cure in Miss Piggle-Wiggle's Magic. And you can see the picture right up here. Slurp, 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 gulp, bang. Christopher Brown was through with his milk. His mother was in the pantry polishing silver, but she didn't have to go into the kitchen to see that Christopher was through eating. She could tell because the loud noises had stopped. Mrs. Brown was terribly ashamed of Christopher's table manners. And she talked and talked and talked and talked and talked and talked, but so far it hadn't done a speck of good. Christopher was 10 years old and a very nice young boy, a very nice little boy in other ways. He had red hair. He was a fine baseball player. He was a good sport. He got excellent grades in school, and he kept his room reasonably neat. But he certainly had horrible table manners. No, that isn't right. He certainly had no table manners at all. He just ate like an animal, a starving, wild animal. Mr. and Mrs. Brown had gradually become used to Christopher's table manners. Of course, they made him eat in the kitchen, but what worried Mrs. Brown so terribly was that some day one of Christopher's friends would invite him to dinner. Not just a children's party. Chris had been to lots of those, and he was so much fun and good at games the children didn't care if he ate like a starving animal. No, Mrs. Brown was afraid he'd be asked to stay all night or to visit another town or to go to the country with some of his friends' family. How dreadful it would be when Christopher took his first bite and began to chew. Christopher chewed with his mouth open so that you could see all of the food as he rinsed it around in his mouth. Also, he smacked his lips so loud it sounded like someone slapping their hands on water. He gulped when he swallowed. He washed food down with milk. He made enormous piles of meat, potatoes, peas, carrots, and gravy on his fork, then thrust the fork so far down you could hardly see the handle. He used his thumb to assemble the big fork loads. He propped his knife and fork against his plate with the handles on the table. He buttered whole slices of bread on his hand. He chopped and smashed and mixed his food until his dinner looked like dog food. He picked up his soup bowl and held it just under his chin while he slurped his soup. He talked while he was chewing. He gestured with a fork full of food so that food the bits of food shot around the room like stones from a slingshot. I could go on indefinitely about Christopher's table manners, but I think I've told you enough to show you that having Christopher sitting beside you at the table was almost exactly like eating next to a wolf. Whoop! There we go. Now you can see the words a little better. Watching him eat was certainly not a sight to whet the appetite. Mrs. Brown rubbed polish on the silver and thought about Christopher's table manners and was sad. There should be a school for table manners, she said to herself, and attendance should be compulsory. The telephone rang. It was Mrs. Thompson, Dick's mother. She said, "I'm having a few of Dick's friends over for dinner a week from Saturday. My brother Charles, the big game hunter, is going to visit us for the next few days, and I thought it would be so nice if some of Dick's friends could meet Charles and see his movies of hunting lions and tigers in Africa. I'm just asking Christopher, Hubert Prentice, and Larry Gray because there will be 12 grown-ups too. Mrs. Brown thanked Mrs. Thompson and said that she knew Christopher would be delighted and went out to make herself a big pot of black coffee. Her hand shook when she poured the first cup. 12 grown-ups and Mrs. Thompson's famous brother all sitting at the table with Christopher. Mrs. Brown couldn't even bear to think about it. "Oh, what will I do? What will I do?" she said. She would give Christopher a good talking to, and he would be very nice and pleasant and agree to everything she said, and really try to have better manners for a meal or two. Then he'd go back. Then back he'd go. Slurp, splash, smack, crunch, choke, gurgle, gulp, bang. Mrs. Brown shuddered. She called her friend Mrs. Pinsell. She said, "Mrs. Pinsell, I'm not going to beat around the bush. My son Christopher has the worst table manners in the whole world, and I don't know how to cure them. Do Percy, Pamela, and Potter have nice table manners?" Mrs. Pinsell said, "Well, I've never noticed, Mrs. Brown. You see, Percy, Pamela, and Potter have always been allowed to make their own decisions about everything. As soon as they were born, we gave them free rein, and actually, I haven't seen them eat for several years." "What do they live on?" Mrs. Brown asked. "Oh, they eat," said Mrs. Pinsell, "but only when the need for food occurs to them. Now, Potter eats nothing but peanut butter and poppy seeds, and he always eats at night. He says that eating during the day is too common a practice and should be stopped. Pamela eats nothing but weenies and bananas. She does her own shopping and peels the bananas herself, which I think is very good progress for a child of 7 years." "I don't," said Mrs. Brown crossly. "I think it's dreadful to let a child live on weenies and bananas. What does Percy eat?" "Percy? Now let me see," said Mrs. Pinsell. "Oh, yes, Percy. Why, Percy eats anything. He is most cooperative. Just give him cookies, candy, marshmallow cake, ice cream, and root beer, and you don't have to worry about Percy. He's a fine boy." Mrs. Brown said, "Well, Miss Pinsell, I guess everyone has their problems. You have cheered me up quite a lot, and I do hope you know a good doctor. You're going to need one." Mrs. Pinsell said, "Oh, I think not. Both Mr. Pinsell and I were brought up the same way, and we're both terribly happy. Mr. Pinsell never eats anything but kippered salmon and grape nuts, and I never eat." Mrs. Brown hung up the phone. "Kippered salmon and grape nuts. Ugh." She called Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle and told her the whole problem. She didn't leave out a thing when she described the way Christopher ate and when she told about the dinner party he had been invited to and how ashamed she was going to be. She got tears in her eyes. Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle said, "Now, Mrs. Brown, don't worry so. Christopher is such a darling boy, and I know how to cure him. It's going to take cooperation on your part and may be a little inconvenient. But I have the cure. I'm going to lend you Lester." "Lester," said Mrs. Brown. "Who is he?" "He is a pig," said Mrs. Pickle-Wickle. "Oh, no," said Mrs. Brown, "not a pig. I have no place to keep a pig, and this is a restricted neighborhood." "Just a minute," said Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle. "Lester is absolutely no trouble. He has beautiful table manners and is very quiet, and sleeps in the basement. Nobody in the neighborhood need know about him. But where shall I put his trowel? Said Mrs. Brown. Oh, Lester doesn't use a trowel, said Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle. Oh, trough, sorry. Trough. That's the whole point. Lester has the most beautiful table manners you have ever seen, and I want him to eat at the kitchen table with Christopher. You'll be very surprised. Lester will teach Christopher how to eat. But it sounds fantastic, said Mrs. Brown. I know, said Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle. Every mother I send Lester to has the same feeling. But let me tell you that once you have had Lester in your home, you won't want to let him come home to me. I always have that trouble. Everybody adores Lester and wants to keep him. Oh, by the way, he likes to sleep on a clean blanket in the basement on the basement floor. He also likes to have a basement door left open so he can go out for his exercise after dark when the neighbors are asleep. Have Christopher stop by after school and I'll send Lester over. Mrs. Martin just returned him this morning. But what does he eat? Said Mrs. Brown. Exactly what Christopher does, except much larger portions. Oh, yes, I almost forgot. Lester is very fond of coffee. He takes cream and sugar, and he often drinks as many as 5 cups at a meal. Don't worry, Mrs. Brown. Fix Lester a nice bed on a clean blanket by the furnace. I'm sure he'll solve all your problems. Goodbye. Mrs. Brown went up and got a clean blue blanket out of the guest room closet and with many misgivings unfolded it and put it on the floor beside the furnace in the basement. She looked at the clock. She had 10 minutes before she could expect Christopher. She made some cocoa with whipped cream, fixed 2 plates of ginger cookies, one much larger than the other, and polished 2 large red apples. She got out spoons and napkins, then remembering what Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle said about Lester's manners, she took 2 of her good linen doilies and put them on the kitchen table. At exactly 3:30 there was a knock at the back door, and there stood Christopher, who usually never knocked, at and a large white pig. Christopher said, Mother, this is Lester, and we got to keep him. Oh, he's fun. He's so smart. He knows everything, don't you, old boy? Mrs. Brown said, Come in, Christopher and Lester. I have some cocoa for you. Christopher said, Oh boy, dashed over to the table and began gulping his cocoa. Lester walked daintily into the kitchen, closed the door behind him, climbed up, and sat down across the table from Christopher. Christopher was jamming his mouth full of cookies and washing it down with cocoa. Lester looked at him, then took one cookie carefully between the split in his front hoof and ate it very slowly with tiny bites. He picked his cocoa cup up with his hoof and, after one small sip, put it carefully down. He patted his snout with his napkin. Christopher stopped eating, or at least stopped chewing, to watch Lester eat. Christopher's mouth was open but full. He had whipped cream on his upper lip and crumbs on his chin. Lester reached across the table and gently closed Christopher's mouth. Then he wiped the cream off his upper lip and the crumbs off his chin. Christopher was delighted. He said with his mouth full, Gosh, you're smart, Lester. Lester put his hoof across his lips and pointed to Christopher's full cheeks to indicate no talking with a full mouth. Christopher looked up at his mother. Isn't he smart, Mother? Isn't Lester wonderful? Lester looked over at Mrs. Brown, and she was sure he winked at her. It usually took Christopher about 3¼ minutes to gag down his cookies and cocoa. This day, either because of the excitement of having Lester with him, or perhaps because of the good example set by Lester, Christopher was still eating at 4 o'clock. Mrs. Brown came downstairs to clear the cocoa things and was most surprised to find that Christopher had only just finished and Lester was about halfway through. Mrs. Brown asked Lester if he'd like some more cocoa, and he nodded his head and handed her his cocoa cup. Christopher said that he didn't care for any more and began eating his apple. Crash, crunch, smash, gulp. Lester reached across the table and took the apple away from him, got down off his chair, went to a drawer in the kitchen, took a knife and cut Christopher's apple into small sections, cored each section, put them on the empty cookie plate, and handed the plate to Christopher. Christopher put a whole section of apple in his mouth. Lester shook his head at him, reached over and took one of the sections and took one very tiny bite. Christopher gulped down the first section, then took another, but this time, instead of stuffing it all in his mouth, he took one small bite. Lester nodded approvingly at him. At 4:30, both Lester and Christopher finished their cocoa and apples, and Christopher took Lester down to the basement to show him his bed. Lester looked carefully around the furnace room, straightened out several wrinkles in the blue guest room blanket, then nodded at Christopher to show him the bed was all right. They went to the game room. There was a red tennis ball on the floor. Lester picked it up and threw it at Chris. Chris caught it and threw it back. Lester caught it neatly in his mouth, then took it out with his hooves and threw it at Chris. They played ball until it was time for the mystery. And you can see the picture of Lester and Chris. Cowboy programs that Christopher listened to every evening. He said to Lester, "Gee, I hope you don't mind, but I always listen to a bunch of keen radio programs at 5 o'clock. Of course, if you'd rather play ball, I don't have to." Lester shook his head, turned and pointed to the fireplace where a nice little fire was laid. Chris said, "Do you want me to light the fire?" "Lester, do you?" Lester nodded. Christopher struck a match and lit the paper. Lester stretched out on the hearth rug and closed his eyes. Christopher crouched by the radio and listened to his program. It was very peaceful. When Mr. Brown came home from work, Mrs. Brown told him about the invitation to dinner to meet Mrs. Thompson's famous brother, Charles, about Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle, and about Lester. Mr. Brown was most skeptical about Lester being able to teach Christopher table manners. "Talk about the blind leading the blind," he said, and laughed loudly. Mrs. Brown said, "Hush, Philip, Lester's right down in the basement, and really he has the most beautiful table manners I've ever seen." Mr. Brown said, "Guess I'll go down and have a look at Lester." He went down the basement stairs whistling, "Who's Afraid of the Big Bad Wolf?" Mrs. Brown groaned. Mr. Brown looked first in the wood room, no Lester. Then he looked in at the furnace room. He saw the blue guest room blanket lying on the floor. So he picked it up and shook it out and took it to the laundry and stuffed it in the laundry chute. He went around the laundry, peering under the washing machine, laundry tubs, and ironing board, saying oink, oink, oink. He got no response. He noticed the basement door was open a little, so he closed it and locked it, muttering about burglars and carelessness. Then, hearing the radio from the game room, he decided to go in and ask Christopher where he kept his pig. He was certainly surprised to see Lester lying on the hearth room in front of a crackling fire, apparently listening to the radio. He said, "So this is Lester. Oink, oink, oink." Lester opened his eyes and gave him a cold look. Then, seeing that it was Mr. Brown, he jumped to his feet and held out his hoof. "Well, I'll be darned," said Mr. Brown, shaking hands and beaming. Christopher said, "Boy, isn't Lester smart, Daddy? Isn't he?" Mr. Brown said, "I always said you could teach a pig anything. Pigs are the smartest animals there are." Lester still looked at him coldly. He hadn't forgiven him for the oink, oink, oink business. Mr. Brown bent over and began scratching Lester behind the ears. Lester gently but firmly pushed his hand away and went over and laid down again by the fire. Mr. Brown, slightly red in the face, said, "Well, I guess I'd better see how dinner is coming along." Christopher said, "Just a minute, Daddy. I want to show you how keen Lester plays ball. Come on, Lester, old boy, let's play a game." He picked up the red tennis ball and Lester rather unwillingly got to his feet. Christopher threw him the ball and he caught it in his mouth and threw it back. Christopher threw it again. Lester caught it, but this time Lester threw it to Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown was so surprised he almost missed, but you could tell he was pleased because he was looking at Lester and smiling. They played three-corner catch until Mrs. Brown called to say dinner was ready and to tell Christopher to wash his hands. There was a small lavatory off the game room, and Christopher rushed in his usual way, wet his hands, splashed a little water on his face, and was going to wipe all the dirt off on the towel when Lester, who had followed him in, took the towel away from him and put it back on the towel rack, put the stopper in the basin, filled it to the brim with hot water, and began washing his own face and hooves thoroughly with lots of soap. When he had finished, he let the water go out of the basin and filled it up with fresh hot water for Christopher. While Lester dried his nice clean face and hooves, Christopher washed thoroughly and with lots of soap. While he dried his face and hands, Lester took the hairbrush and dampened and smoothed the bristles on his neck and around his ears. Christopher watched him, then dampened and brushed his hair too. Then they went to dinner. Unfortunately, Mrs. Brown, forgetting about Lester, had spare ribs for dinner. They were crisp and brown, and Mr. Brown gave Lester an extra large helping. Lester sat down at the table, smiled because everything looked and smelled so delicious, unfolded his napkin, took a sip of milk, then cut a small piece of spare rib. He put it in his mouth and began to chew, then turned terribly pale and pushed his plate away. Christopher watched him anxiously. Gosh, Lester, what's the matter? Don't you like spare ribs? Lester took his spare ribs and put them on Christopher's plate. Christopher said, Lester, I'll go tell Mother you don't like spare ribs. She'll fry you up some egg or something. That's what she does for Daddy when he doesn't like something. He started to get down from his chair. Lester reached over and took a hold of his shoulder. He shook his head sternly and pointed to Christopher's dinner, and by chewing motions indicated Christopher was to continue with his dinner. Lester had 2 helpings of dressing, sweet potatoes, and string beans. He also ate his salad, 2 dishes of peaches, 2 pieces of applesauce cake, and drank 4 cups of coffee. Christopher ate all his dinner with much less noise than usual. He even asked Lester if it was all right to pick his spare rib bones up in his fingers. After he and Christopher and Mr. Brown After dinner, he and Christopher and Mr. Brown played ball for a while. Then it was time for Chris to go to bed. He and Mr. Brown said good night to Lester and went upstairs. Lester went into his bed, but it wasn't there. He looked all over the basement, thinking perhaps Mrs. Brown had moved it. He couldn't find it any place. Then he checked to see if the back door had been left open and found it shut and locked. He looked again to see if he could find the blanket. It just wasn't anywhere, so he decided to go upstairs and ask Mrs. Brown where it was. He went up to the basement stairs. Had quite a time with the basement door, which stuck, trotted through the kitchen and dining room and stood politely at the living room. Mr. and Mrs. Brown were playing cribbage. Cribbage is a game my husband and I play, and it's really fun. It has to do with math. And arguing, so they didn't see Lester for a few minutes. When Mrs. Brown happened to look up, she said, Why, Lester, have you come up to visit us? Lester shook his head. Mrs. Brown said, What's the matter then? Is it cold down in the base? Is it cold down in the basement? Lester shook his head. Oh, I know, Mr. Brown said. You want me to play ball with you, don't you, old boy? Lester shook his head. Then, deciding it would be a very good way to get them downstairs, he nodded his head vigorously several times. Mr. Brown beamed. Okay, old boy, he said. Come on down, Alice, and watch. Mrs. Brown said she'd like to, so they went downstairs. But Lester, in spite of his flawless manners, went first, and instead of going to the game room, stood by the furnace room door. Mrs. Brown looked in the furnace room. But where is your blanket? She said. Lester shook his head. Mrs. Brown said, Why, that's the funniest thing. I put the green guest room blanket on the floor here this afternoon. I wonder what could have happened to it. Mr. Brown, looking very embarrassed, went and got it out of the laundry chute. He said, I didn't know it was Lester's bed. I just thought it had fallen on the floor. Mrs. Brown spread it out on the floor, and Lester carefully smoothed out the wrinkles and turned one corner over like a little pillow. Mr. and Mrs. Brown watched him in amazement. I've never in my life seen such a smart animal, said Mrs. Brown. He seems almost human. Lester looked up at her quizzically. Now you're all ready to go to bed, so I guess we'll go upstairs, said Mr. Brown. He turned toward the stairway, but Lester took his hooves and gently pushed him towards the basement door. Now what's the matter, old boy? Said Mr. Brown. The basement door is locked and there's not a thing to worry about. Mrs. Brown said, well, of course, that's the trouble. Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle told me to be sure and leave the basement door open a crack so Lester can go out in the night and get his exercise. She unlatched the door and opened it 1 inch. Lester nodded approval, waited politely while they preceded him through the doorway and started up the stairs. Then he went in, laid down on the blue blanket, and went to sleep. The next morning, when Christopher came downstairs and found his mother frying bacon, he was shocked. He said, my gosh, Mother, don't you have any heart at all? Last night you had spare ribs for dinner and Lester almost got sick. And now this morning you're cooking bacon? Mrs. Brown said, why, Chris, I thought I had a delicious dinner last night. Spare ribs have always been one of your favorite foods. Chris said, but Mother, spare ribs are pork. They come from dead pigs. Pardon me? Mrs. Brown clapped her hands over her mouth. She said, oh, Chris, I didn't think about that. I'm terribly sorry. Do you suppose Lester noticed? Chris said, I should say he did notice. He took one bite and then turned pale and pushed his plate away. I was going to tell you, but he wouldn't let me. Mrs. Brown said, come, hurry. Before he comes up, take this bacon to your father. I'll give you and Lester cereal and scrambled eggs and toast for breakfast. Hurry now, take the bacon to Daddy and I'll air out the kitchen. She opened the back door and shooed the bacon smoke out with her apron so that when Lester came upstairs a few minutes later, the kitchen smelled only of oatmeal and buttered toast. As a usual thing at breakfast, Chris dumped a pitcher of cream on his mush and 4 heaping spoons of sugar, then stirred and stirred as though he were mixing cement. When the mush was exactly the right consistency and the correct degree of coolness, he would lift the bowl up to just below his chin and shovel in the mush as fast as he could swallow. This morning, forgetting about Lester, he began his usual gluttonous proceedings, dumped the entire pitcher of cream on his mush, and was just reaching for the sugar when he looked up and saw Lester looking sadly into the empty cream pitcher. Instantly he was sorry. He said, oh gee, Lester, I didn't mean to be such a pig. I mean such a glutton. Lester just looked at him. Chris said, I'll get some more cream. Wait a minute. Lester shook his head. He reached over and picked up Chris's bowl of oatmeal, then carefully poured half the cream in his own cereal. Chris said, that's right. We'll each have half. Would you like some sugar? Lester nodded and helped himself to 2 level spoons of sugar. Chris, who had watched him, did the same. When Chris started his cement mixer stirring, Lester reached over, took his spoon away, and showed Chris how cereal ought to be eaten. 1 spoonful at a time, lifted slowly and daintily from the bowl so that each spoonful contained hot cereal, cold cream, and sweet sugar. Chris tried it. He said, "Say, Lester, this tastes much better than the old way." Lester nodded and smiled. When Christopher began to scrape his dish, Lester shook his head and pointed to his spoon, placed on the plate beside his almost empty dish. When Chris was still eating his scram when Chris was eating his scrambled eggs, Lester reached over and closed his mouth 3 times. He showed him that he must break his toast into small pieces and then he must not hold the toast in the palm of his hands when putting on jam. He made him put down his milk glass and wipe the milk mustache from his upper lip between sips. Chris obviously didn't mind these criticisms because he hugged Lester goodbye when he left for school and promised to run all the way home for lunch. It was a beautiful morning and Mrs. Brown did a large washing. She went to hang it on the line. Lester helped her carry the clothes basket of wet clothes from the basement, handed her the clothespins as she needed them, and when the washing was all up, he lay down on the grass in the sun, well hidden from the neighbors by 2 sheets and a tablecloth. Mrs. Brown knelt down and timidly stroked his back. She said, "Thanks so much for helping with the clothes, Lester, and thank you for helping me with Chris's manners. I can see a great improvement already." Lester grunted a little. By the night of Dick Thompson's dinner party, Chris's table manners were absolutely perfect, and the Brown family all loved Lester so much they couldn't even think about his ever leaving. Lester came upstairs with Chris while he bathed and got dressed. He washed Christopher's back and made him wash his ears twice. He made him polish his shoes and he sent him back to his room for a clean handkerchief. After Chris had gone, Lester went out to the kitchen to wait for dinner. Noticing immediately that there was no place set for him on the kitchen table, and feeling lonely for Chris and quite sad, he started down to the basement to lie down on his blanket. Mrs. Brown called to him. She said, "Lester, I thought that as long as Chris wasn't here, you would like to eat in the dining room with Mr. Brown and me." Lester nodded his head vigorously and trotted happily after her into the dining room. They had a roast of lamb for dinner, and even though Lester ate 3 large helpings, his table manners were so beautiful that Mr. and Mrs. Brown just stared at him in admiration. After dinner, Mr. Brown and Lester played catch while Mrs. Brown washed the dishes. Then they all sat in the living room and listened to the radio and waited for Christopher. He came back home at 10 o'clock, bursting with excitement and filled with the tales of Africa and lions. Everyone listened to his stories, heard what the Thompsons had to eat and what Uncle Charlie looked like, and then went to bed. The next morning, Mrs. Brown had 2 telephone calls. The first one made her very proud. It was from Mrs. Thompson, and she said that she just had to call Mrs. Brown and tell her that in all her life she had never seen such a beautifully behaved boy as Christopher. "His table manners are simply perfect," she said, and Mrs. Brown smiled and smiled. The second telephone call was from Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle, and it made Mrs. Brown very sad. Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle asked Mrs. Brown how she liked Lester, and Mrs. Brown said, "Oh, Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle, he has such perfectly beautiful manners. he is such a wonderful teacher, and he is so charming that just feel I feel just like crying when I think of all the times I said that people are pigs, or ate like pigs, or are selfish like pigs. Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle said, "Well, of course, all pigs aren't like Lester, but he certainly is a dear, and I hate to take him away from you so soon, but I just had an emergency call from Mrs. Burbank. Tell Christopher to bring Lester over on his way back to school this noon." Then Mrs. Brown said goodbye to Lester. She had tears in her eyes, and she thought he seemed a little sad at leaving. And that is the end of The Bad Table Manners Cure. Our next story will be The Interrupters. I thank you for being here with me and listening to the chapter. I just wanted to let you know there are a couple things that I just felt like I needed to share. To begin with, if I don't read perfectly, well, I am dyslexic, and sometimes my words get twisted around. Sometimes I'm even talking like a normal person, and I'll get the words incorrect. Also, we're not all perfect, and I'm very proud that I can read. It can be a challenge at times. As you can see, sometimes I have to slow down and fix my words. And part of that is the dyslexia, and part of it is just me. So, the other thing I wanted to mention was that I have a new work schedule. So, if you're having a hard time waiting, it's because, and I will post this in my community tab, that I may have to change my days up a little bit. I am working 2 jobs, and YouTube is not even one of them. So, hopefully, this channel will grow and will become something of a revenue source. But if not, I'm just going to keep practicing my reading on here. And I hope that you're able to enjoy it. These are some of my favorite stories, and I love children's books. So I feel that they're the best practice I can have as a dyslexic reader. Anyway, have a beautiful day, and goodbye.